I want you to imagine, just for a moment, that you have reached the absolute pinnacle of your career.
Right, the absolute top of the mountain.
Exactly. You've landed the most prestigious job in the world in your field.
Mm.
You've got immense wealth. You have the ear of powerful political leaders and, hundreds of brilliant students hanging on to your every word.
You are basically a massive, undeniable success by every metric society has.
Yeah. And then, at the absolute height of this fame, you wake up one day and realize you suddenly, well, you can't eat.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Your body simply refuses to digest food, and worse than that, you lose your voice.
That's terrifying.
Right. You stand up to give a lecture to the hundreds of people waiting for your wisdom, and you physically cannot force a single word out of your throat.
It's just a total shutdown. I mean, to have your entire identity tied to your intellect and your ability to speak, only to have your own body completely betray you.
Today, we're taking a deep dive into the life of the man who lived that exact nightmare. We're exploring the story of Al-Ghazali, an 11th century Persian polymath, theologian, philosopher, and legal scholar.
And his work was so universally acclaimed in the Islamic world that he was awarded the honorific title of Hujjat al-Islam, which translates to the proof of Islam.
But we aren't just here to read a list of his historical accomplishments. We're diving into a story-driven biography today.
Right, because the story is wild.
It really is. We want to understand his epic, meteoric rise to power, the dramatic and paralyzing breakdown he suffered, his stunning 10-year disappearance from public life, and, the incredibly controversial legacy he left behind.
Which includes a massive historical debate over whether or not he single-handedly killed the scientific revolution of the Islamic Golden Age.
Yeah, that is a tremendously heavy accusation to carry.
It really is. But to truly understand the weight of that accusation and the psychological terror of his breakdown, you have to understand the height from which he fell.
So where do we start?
Well, Al-Ghazali was born around 1058 in Tusas, which is a city in the Khorasan region of what is now Iran.
Okay.
And you have to look at the geopolitical climate of the time. The Seljuk Empire is rapidly growing in power, and they're heavily influencing the older Abbasid Caliphate based in Baghdad.
Right, so there's a lot of shifting power dynamics.
Exactly. And from a very young age, Al-Ghazali was marked as this generational intellectual talent. He actually studied under Al-Juwayni, who was the most outstanding Muslim scholar of his era.
So he was essentially on the fastest possible track to the top. He catches the attention of Nizam al-Mulk, who is the incredibly powerful Grand Vizier of the Seljuk Empire.
Yeah, Nizam al-Mulk recognizes this young man's genius and essentially just hands him the keys to the kingdom.
By the year 1091, Al-Ghazali is appointed as the head of the Nizamiyya of Baghdad. I mean, this was the most prestigious and intellectually challenging professorial position in the entire Muslim world.
And he was only in his early 30s. He's holding a position that seasoned scholars spend their entire lifetimes trying to achieve.
That's incredible pressure. What was he actually doing day to day?
He was teaching Islamic jurisprudence, giving fatwas, which are official, binding legal and religious rulings, writing complex treatises, and advising the highest political elite.
Wow.
Yeah, he was the undisputed intellectual center of Baghdad. The empire literally ran on his ideas.
But then, in 1095, the wall hits him. The physical and emotional collapse we talked about at the beginning takes hold.
Right. The physical manifestation of this is fascinating. He suffers from a total loss of appetite, severe indigestion, and this complete vocal paralysis.
Okay, let's unpack this for a second because it perfectly mirrors what we would diagnose today as a severe, paralyzing case of executive burnout.
Oh, absolutely.
Your mind tries to keep pushing, but your body keeps the score and eventually pulls the emergency brake. And he consults the top doctors in Baghdad, the absolute best physicians of the medieval era, and they examine him.
And their conclusion is stunning for the 11th century. They determine that his physical ailments have a purely psychological and internal spiritual cause.
It's amazing they recognized psychosomatic illness back then. They basically said medicine couldn't fix him because his sickness was in his soul.
Exactly. And in his later autobiography, which is called Deliverance from Error, Al-Ghazali actually diagnoses his own crisis.
What does he say?
He realized his underlying intentions had become entirely corrupted. He looked in the mirror and realized he wasn't teaching for the sake of uncovering truth or serving God.
He was doing it for the prestige.
Yes, the prestige, the wealth, the social status. He was surrounded by sycophants, and frankly, he loved it.
Right.
He had elevated his own ego above his faith, and that realization created a cognitive dissonance so severe that his body literally shut down.
So he had a complete crisis of authenticity. His whole life at the top was a performance. So he decides he has to get out.
But he can't just hand in a 2 weeks' notice and walk away. He is far too important to the state.
Right, the political and academic leadership would never allow their star intellectual to just abandon his post.
He was trapped by his own success. So he has to engineer this highly sophisticated escape plan.
How does he pull it off?
He publicly announces that he is going on the Hajj, the religious pilgrimage to Mecca.
Oh, brilliant, because that's a mandatory religious obligation in Islam, so politically no one could reasonably deny him the right to go.
Exactly. But behind the scenes, he is quietly and methodically dismantling his entire life.
He sells off his belongings, right?
Yeah. He establishes a trust fund to ensure his family is well taken care of, and then he takes the rest of his immense wealth and gives it all away to charity.
Wow.
He sheds every single thing that tethered him to his identity as the great professor of Baghdad.
And then he vanishes. I mean, this is the part of his biography that is almost hard to comprehend. We are talking about the intellectual heavyweight of the era, the guy who whispered in the ears of emperors.
And where does he end up?
He eventually makes his way to Damascus. And what is he doing? He takes a job as a humble sweeper at the Umayyad Mosque.
That is just a staggering drop in status.
It is. He sweeps the floors, and he lives in total isolation, up in one of the minarets. It is the ultimate historical dropout story.
It's a radical, almost violent shift in lifestyle, but this 10-year disappearance wasn't him just hiding from the world out of depression.
Right, it was intentional.
Yes, in the Islamic tradition, this practice is known as uzla, or deliberate spiritual seclusion. And this decade turned out to be the most intellectually and spiritually productive period of his entire life.
So up in that minaret, stripping away the noise, the politics, and the massive ego, he writes his magnum opus.
It is a monumental work called The Revival of Religious Sciences, or Ihya Ulum al-Din.
That is an incredibly ambitious title. I mean, he's essentially looking at the landscape of his faith and saying, the way we are practicing religion right now is dead, and I'm going to resuscitate it.
He was trying to heal a massive fracture in the Islamic world. At the time, there was a deep tension between Orthodox Sunni theology.
The scholars focused on strict jurisprudence and outward laws.
Right, tension between them and Sufism, which is the mystical, internal, spiritual dimension of Islam.
And they did not get along.
Not at all. The Orthodox scholars viewed Sufis with deep suspicion, thinking they were dangerously ignoring the rules, and the Sufis thought the Orthodox scholars were rigid bureaucrats with no real connection to God.
And Al-Ghazali bridges this divide perfectly. He argued that doing the physical motions of prayer perfectly according to the law means absolutely nothing if your heart is full of arrogance and pride.
Exactly. He said the outward laws of jurisprudence were the vessel, but the inward spiritual sincerity of Sufism was the water inside.
Oh, that's a great metaphor.
Yeah.
An empty vessel is useless, but water without a vessel just spills onto the ground.
He completely changed the paradigm. The impact of this book was monumental. It became one of the most frequently recited texts in the Muslim world after the Quran and the Hadith.
Wait, really? That popular?
Yes. A famous later scholar, Al-Nawawi, even stated that if all the other books of Islam were lost in a fire and only the Ihya remained, it would suffice to replace all of them.
But we shouldn't assume it was universally loved right out of the gate, right? Al-Ghazali was a deeply disruptive thinker.
Very disruptive. In fact, shortly after it was written, the book was actually burned in Almoravid, Spain.
Burned by the establishment, I imagine, because he was legitimizing Sufism.
Partly because of the Sufism, yes, but mostly because he used the book to heavily criticize the fuqaha, the traditional jurists.
He went after the lawyers.
He called them out for meddling too much in secular politics and losing their spiritual way. He was essentially looking back at his former colleagues, the very establishment he used to lead, and calling them corrupt.
So naturally, the establishment fought back. But his intellectual framing was so rigorous that his vision ultimately won out, and he is largely credited with safely integrating Sufism into mainstream Orthodox Islam.
But you know, that intense spiritual introspection didn't turn him into a passive pacifist.
Not at all. The clarity he found in the minaret gave him the intellectual ammunition to pick a fight with the greatest philosophers in history.
He didn't just write guides to saving your soul. He actively stepped into the ring to debate the fundamental nature of reality.
Right, his intellectual combativeness never left him. It just found a new, highly specific target.
He focused his sights on a loosely defined group of Islamic philosophers known as the Falasifa.
And these were brilliant thinkers, most notably Avicenna and Al-Farabi, who were heavily influenced by the ancient Greeks, specifically Aristotle and Plato.
Yeah, Al-Ghazali looks at their work and writes a blistering, incredibly famous critique called The Incoherence of the Philosophers.
What a title.
Right. He observes how these scholars are taking Greek logic and applying it to Islamic metaphysics, and he tells them they are fundamentally misunderstanding how the universe actually works.
And the core of his critique rests on a concept called theological occasionalism. The Greek-influenced philosophers argued that the universe operates on independent natural laws of cause and effect,
Which Al-Ghazali completely rejects.
Yeah. He argued that causal events in nature are not the product of material things interacting with each other, but rather the immediate, direct, and constant will of God at every single microsecond.
He used a brilliant analogy to explain this, which is the cotton and the fire.
Oh, I love this part.
If you take a piece of cotton and you touch it to a flame, the cotton catches fire and burns. Now, you and I and the Greek philosophers would say the fire caused the cotton to burn. That is a natural law.
But Al-Ghazali says no. The fire doesn't have the independent power or agency to burn the cotton. The cotton burns only because God directly wills the cotton to burn at that exact moment.
He is stripping away any intermediary power between God and creation. It is essentially a framework where the universe is a series of ordinary miracles that God just happens to repeat consistently.
Think of it like a modern video game engine. When a digital fire burns a digital tree on your screen, the fire didn't cause the tree to disappear.
Right. The game's processor simply updated the pixels in that exact frame.
Exactly. Al-Ghazali is basically saying God is the processor, rendering the entire universe frame by frame, atom by atom, at every single millisecond.
That is a phenomenal way to understand occasionalism. But to the rationalist philosophers, this concept was deeply problematic.
I can imagine.
In the following century, the great philosopher Ibn Rushd, known in the West as Averroes, drafted a massive point-by-point rebuttal to Al-Ghazali called The Incoherence of the Incoherence.
Amazing naming convention they had going on there.
Ibn Rushd argued that God created the natural laws, embedded them into the universe, and therefore humans can and should discern those patterns. He argued that calling the philosophers incoherent for believing in cause and effect was itself an incoherent statement.
Okay, so what does this all mean? I have to jump in here with some genuine curiosity, because this seems like a massive problem.
How so?
If he is telling an entire empire that cause and effect is basically a mirage, that the video game processor could just decide not to render gravity tomorrow,
Yes.
how does anyone build a society or do science? That sounds incredibly dangerous to human progress.
You have just perfectly articulated the exact question that has fueled a massive historical debate for the last century. You're outlining what modern historians call the science killer myth.
The science killer myth.
Yeah. For a very long time, many Orientalist scholars and even some prominent modern mathematicians have pointed the finger directly at Al-Ghazali and claimed he is the singular reason the Islamic golden age of science eventually died.
I mean, it seems like a logical conclusion to draw from his philosophy. By attacking philosophy and pushing occasionalism, didn't he nullify critical thinking and make empirical science impossible?
It is a very neat, convenient narrative, but modern historical scholarship pushes back against it heavily. Scholars like George Saliba, a professor of Arabic and Islamic science, point out that the entire premise of this sudden decline is historically flawed.
So science didn't just abruptly stop in the 11th century after Al-Ghazali published his critique.
Not at all. Saliba points to massive continuous advances in fields like astronomy and mathematics that went on all the way into the 14th and 15th centuries, long after Al-Ghazali was dead.
And furthermore, we have direct evidence from Al-Ghazali himself that contradicts the idea that he hated science.
Oh, yes. In his autobiography, Deliverance from Error, he explicitly warns his readers against rejecting proven sciences out of some misguided sense of religious loyalty.
He actually wrote, "Great indeed is the crime against religion committed by anyone who supposes that Islam is to be championed by the denial of mathematical sciences."
That quote is the key to understanding his true motive. Historian Faris Al-Khatib explains that Al-Ghazali wasn't trying to destroy the scientific enterprise, he was actually trying to protect it from theoretical overreach.
What does that mean exactly?
Al-Ghazali saw these Greek-influenced philosophers taking the rigorous, proven tools of mathematics and astronomy and then applying that same unearned confidence to metaphysics.
Oh, I see. They were trying to prove or disprove the eternal nature of the universe, or the exact attributes of God, using the same tools they use to measure the angle of a triangle.
Exactly. He was essentially policing the borders of different academic disciplines. He was saying, keep your math in the math department and keep your theology in the theology department.
He believed that if the general public saw philosophers making wild, unprovable claims about God, and those same philosophers were also the leading mathematicians, the public might end up throwing out the valid mathematics along with the bad philosophy.
Precisely. He wanted to save the empirical, measurable sciences from being dragged down by the baggage of theoretical conjecture. He was an incredibly pragmatic thinker, which is an aspect of his personality that often gets overshadowed by his heavy theological work.
Let's pivot and explore that pragmatism, because his views on tolerance and society and everyday human life are remarkably nuanced.
Yeah, he wrote a book called The Decisive Criterion for Distinguishing Islam from Clandestine Unbelief.
Another light read.
Right. But you have to remember the political climate of the 11th century. It was an era of immense sectarian strife. Different Islamic sects were constantly at each other's throats, weaponizing excommunication, a practice known as takfir, to label their political or theological rivals as heretics or apostates.
It was a highly volatile environment. But Al-Ghazali steps into this chaos and advocates for a remarkably wide tent.
He vehemently veers away from the hardline religious persecution of his day.
He argued that as long as a believer holds fundamental faith in God and the Prophet Muhammad, the different ways they might practice or interpret their faith in good conscience shouldn't be labeled as heretical.
He essentially stripped the clerics of their power to excommunicate people, arguing that only the Prophet himself had the authority to deem a faithful Muslim an infidel.
He was calling for intellectual humility. He certainly believed there was a most correct way to practice, but he absolutely opposed the violent persecution of those who practiced differently within the broader fold of the faith.
He really wanted to lower the temperature of the religious debates that were tearing society apart. And this practical worldview extended deeply into his thoughts on economics and money as well.
Yeah, his economic philosophy is fascinating because he views the flow of goods through the lens of communal religious duty.
He wasn't a strict communist. He didn't believe the government needed to enforce absolute income equality. But he deeply hated excessive materialism.
And predatory capitalism, too.
Yeah.
He believed that earning a living was necessary for survival, but that wealth was really only ethically valid for two things: keeping your family healthy and helping your community.
Right. Why did he think chasing massive profit margins was so bad? It wasn't just an economic theory for him. It was about the soul.
Here's where it gets really interesting. He believed that taking too much profit practically harmed your neighbor, which in turn spiritually poisoned you. He saw trade not just as business, but as a mechanism of mutual support.
So a merchant crossing the desert to bring grain to a city is performing a religious duty because the city needs to eat.
Exactly. But if that merchant price gouges the starving city, he corrupts the religious nature of his work and disconnects himself from his community.
But he also recognized a crucial reality about human society. While he personally lived as an ascetic sweeping a mosque for a decade, he knew that if everyone adopted a purely subsistence lifestyle, the entire society would collapse.
He realized you can't build an economy on monks.
Right.
He understood that cities require cross-border trade to survive. Goods have to move.
Yeah.
He actually supported robust trade because it made necessary goods accessible to the masses.
He just wanted an economy driven by necessity, communal health, and ethical exchange, rather than endless, selfish accumulation.
Be engaged in the world, trade your goods, take care of your family, but do not let the pursuit of wealth hollow out your soul.
Which perfectly brings his philosophy full circle back to why he fled Baghdad in the first place. He had let the wealth hollow him out, and he spent the rest of his life teaching others how to avoid that exact trap.
And when you look at his historical legacy, the footprint he left behind is staggering.
Within the Islamic world, he is widely considered a mujaddid.
Which is what, exactly?
In traditional Islamic thought, a mujaddid is a renewer of the faith who appears once every century to restore and revitalize the religious community. Al-Ghazali is almost universally recognized as the renewer of the 11th century.
But his influence didn't stop at the borders of the Muslim world. His rigorous philosophical and theological writings circulated widely and cross-pollinated with other major global traditions.
Oh, absolutely. The great Jewish theologian Maimonides was deeply influenced by Al-Ghazali's frameworks.
And Western Christian philosophers like Thomas Aquinas incorporated his ideas into their own theological architecture.
Centuries later, even René Descartes engaged with concepts that trace their lineage back to Al-Ghazali. His fingerprints are literally all over the intellectual history of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance.
So toward the end of his life, did he ever go back to teaching?
He did briefly return to public teaching. The grand viziers of the Seljuk Empire relentlessly pressured him to come back to the grand stage.
I imagine it's hard to say no to them forever.
He reluctantly capitulated for a short time in the city of Nishapur, but he noted a profound difference in himself, stating that whereas before he taught knowledge that brought prestige and fame, now he was teaching knowledge that led people to renounce position and ego.
He didn't stay long in the spotlight, though. He eventually declined further invitations to return to Baghdad.
Right. He chose to return to his hometown of Tus. There, he built a small madrasa, an educational theological college, and a nearby lodge for Sufis.
And he spent his final years teaching locally, receiving visitors, and writing in peace. He passed away right there near his home in December of 1111 at the age of about 53.
When you zoom out, he lived multiple lifetimes in those 5 decades. He went from a brilliant orphan in Khorasan to the absolute pinnacle of political and academic power in Baghdad, to a penniless sweeper in Damascus, and finally, to the quiet sage of Tus.
His life is a profound testament to the sheer courage it takes to look at your own overwhelming success, realize it is destroying your soul, and have the strength to completely change course.
It really is.
And that brings us to a final thought for you, our listener, to mull over as we wrap up this deep dive. We live in an era that is absolutely obsessed with status.
Oh, without a doubt.
We're constantly told to build our personal brand, to hustle for the next promotion, to accumulate followers, and to cling tightly to whatever prestige we manage to grab.
It's exhausting.
It is. Al-Ghazali had the ultimate personal brand of the 11th century. He had every metric of success a human being could want. But he only found his true voice and his lasting legacy when he threw the brand away to sweep a floor in silence.
That's a powerful realization.
So as you look at the architecture of your own life, the question is, what might you need to walk away from to finally find yours?